This is Get in the Mecha, the weekly anime and manga show where we take things one step further. I analyze everything from arcs to OPs to episodes in my wacky but enjoyable quest to make sense of all of it. Welcome back to Get in the Mecha. I'm your host Jamal today, and in today's episode, or the first episode of the year, we are kind of just jumping right into it, but yes, Happy New Year, and in today's episode we are tackling the notion of smoothness and attempting to rethink it in animation. I have been doing a lot of animation related episodes to end the year and I want to do more of these. This podcast will always just be an analysis podcast generally, and it won't focus on a specific type of analysis, but I do want to do a lot more animation analysis and to kick off the year almost like we did last year as well with Understanding Sakuga, which an episode which I absolutely hate. Today I want to take the time to talk about this notion of smoothness and why I don't particularly think it's problematic, but I think there are things we can learn from using it and how we can frame animation in a way that doesn't depend on this notion of smoothness. So in today's episode, basically what I want to discuss is not really what is smoothness, but more exactly what is the objective of animation. Is the objective of animation to be smooth? What is animation supposed to do, and how do we look at animation? And I'll use a few examples to kind of get there, as you could see from the thumbnail. And so let's just get into the episode. First episode of the year, episode 76 of Get in the Mecha, rethinking the notion of smoothness in animation. Nothing has really changed for this quote-unquote year, even though I saw you 7 days ago. I spoke to you guys 7 days ago, but even so, nothing really has changed as in the practice of giving my alerts as always, and that applies to this episode too, despite it being an animation analysis. And in the case of this episode, there shouldn't be any spoilers. This episode really is, okay, there will be very minor spoilers for Akira, but you're really going to have to read into them. So I'm basically going to say no spoilers because I still need to rewatch Akira because it hasn't fully sunken in from the narrative level, but I'm mostly talking about it from the very surface level, about some of its characters and stuff. But this isn't the Akira cast episode or something, but I am going to be zooming in on Akira specifically because I think that's where a lot of this discourse starts from, or it's an amazing case study for understanding this idea of smoothness and where it really comes from. So just to summarize, not really any spoilers. If you're really pedantic about it, then maybe a minor spoilers for Akira, but besides that, we are heading in relatively spoiler-free or spoilerless. Before we engage with the case study to really kick off the episode being Akira, I want to talk a bit about art and how we managed to understand it. Almost all art is compared relatively, whether we like it or not. It's a thing that we simply have to get used to as it's a natural process. The way we understand art is relative to other things of which we've seen. We understand them comparatively to others. Other compositions we understand relative to the other compositions, and we manage to flesh out our own sort of understanding of the world, almost you can say, and the art world specifically, through relativity. We manage to sort of generate these internal hierarchies within our own heads, simply because it's the way we navigate around the media we consume. I hate to admit it, but it's also something that I do as well. I know that there's let me call it a genre of people, as much as that doesn't make sense, but there are a genre of people that love to, or on social media, use the more than less than sign to compare things. And even though I find that a very abrasive way of looking at art, internally we do that even on a very subtle level, not even as in what is better or worse, but we understand one piece. When I say one piece, I mean a piece of art by looking at it next to the other piece or the other things of which we've seen, and that's really how we actually gain an understanding to what we find good or bad or simply different. However, where art discourse is today, we refer to art as subjective, as opposed to if we were to go back hundreds of years, there were many other different schools of thoughts that would suggest art is objective. The notion that art is subjective is simply a philosophical view, in some sense. And now the notion that there are genuinely fixed hierarchies has collapsed, really. You don't really, okay, besides the odd, this is the objective best thing sort of discussion, most of the time people accept passively that art is subjective and these hierarchies that they have are internal and based on taste. Where this starts to relate to smoothness, in my opinion, is when we vocalize these internal hierarchies, and it's how we do it which is very important. How we engage with media beyond the text is probably what manages to preserve culture and preserve art. How we understand it and make sense of it and interpret it and bend it to our own experiences is probably the core of what it is, and that's why it still manages to exist, because the phenomena or the beauty of it is that everyone experiences it differently, and that experience is preserved within us. But I do think, to get a bit more on track, that it's some of these descriptors and or the means of vocalizing these hierarchies that I think can be a bit, quote-unquote, problematic or have some issues sometimes, on the basis that they manage to shun kind of how exactly art is supposed to perform, and by putting things to a sort of unrealistic or narrow standard, we forget how subjectivity works in a sense, but also the potential that art has to do multiple things and doesn't strive to do one thing in particular. Attaching art to a specific thing or function as to what it should be is very different to recognizing the potential of what it can be, and that is where my sort of fundamental or underlying problem with the notion of smoothness really is. Don't get me wrong, I'm not particularly critiquing the term smoothness exactly, or in the very literal sense. This word could be replaced, and this whole argument and podcast could be oriented around the notion of complexity, I say in quotation marks, but it isn't the very idea of smoothness that I'm critiquing, but it's really the use of the term and how it's used, which is rather obstructive to animation discourse. Smoothness isn't wrong or inherently bad, but I think the reason why we need to revise how we use the term when describing animation is that it usually is, I kind of want to call it a plug on the rest of the discussion. Often when an animation is described as smooth or things are described as clean, that's another good term, it usually ends there, as if that is kind of all it is. It's a smooth animation, it's so smooth, but why is it smooth, or why does it have to be smooth? Why is smooth the standard? And that is something which I want to challenge. Now we move a bit onto Akira, and Akira is an anime which I quite like. I do need to rewatch it, honestly. I heard that it is on Amazon Prime, I do believe, so it will definitely be a fun watch since I can do that. But Akira, even though I did put it in the thumbnail, isn't an anime that I dislike or something, and also I don't want you to get me wrong and think that I'm critiquing Akira. No, I'm not. I'm not critiquing what it is. I'm critiquing, or I'm at least pushing back against the discourse that often comes out of the discussion of Akira's animation. Akira and smoothness unfortunately go hand to hand, and that is partially because a lot of the discourse stems from this idea, which is false, that Akira is fully animated on ones. Every drawing is a unique one, and there's no twos, there are no different timings, there's no differentiation in this. This is false, and it's something which I even believed for a long time, but it doesn't take long to disprove it. It takes literally extracting almost any scene from Akira, or not every, obviously, because there's a very good use of timings within the film, but it isn't only on this. And so this 24 FPS quote-unquote myth, there's a very good video. I honestly can't remember the name of the creator, but I will link it in the show notes. The 24 FPS myth, it's a really good mythbuster video, but the point is that Akira uses a wide variety of timings, but it's where the problem problem I think comes from is that the false idea that it's animated fully in ones means that it's perceived like that is the standard or the golden standard of anime and animation really. But yes, it has a high frame count, but Akira does a lot more than that, and that is where I think a lot of the conversation is disrupted. If smoothness was the objective best thing, then Akira could be, and probably would be, considered the greatest thing in the history of Japanese animation simply because it has one of the highest frame counts out there and it's the smoothest thing ever. But that is the very problem. Smoothness is what animation should be, and it is the best thing for it to be. But I don't think that is the case. If we just quickly continue to discuss timings here, yes, the work of animators like Tatsuki Tanaka, Toshiaki Hontani, who animated some very famous scenes within the film, yes, it is phenomenal and I agree 100%, but it goes beyond just being a smooth animation. It's the movement and timings of the smoke or the explosions or the morphing or whatever they animate goes to do a lot more for Otomo's narrative. If we consider it manages to communicate the power and magnitude of power which one possesses, and at times the horror and corruption which comes out of possessing power in itself. And that is what I think. Maybe this is a problem beyond just smoothness as an idea, and I did say that this could go beyond just smoothness. It could be any sort of what I would consider to be a rather empty word, like complexity. But the problem really is that it's making the connection between animation and portrayal, I think. Maybe this is more than just this idea which I'm discussing here, but it's just a fundamental problem with linking together what animation does for narrative as opposed to narrative is simply supported by good animation. An idea which I'm heavily against because yes, it does, but in part we deny the reverse, being animation is equally good for portrayals and communicating emotion, and that's something which I kind of really want to bring forward within these animation podcasts and stuff. Despite the focus on timings, a rather bland conversation and partially false conversation about timings in my opinion, Akira manages to still teach us so many more things about animation, which I think gets squashed by this notion of smoothness. If we take the morphing within the anime or the movie, it shows us how transformation sequences, again within the form of morphing, can be so well done, as we can go from a human being to a full-on destructive baby, kind of ripping their insides out. It's also a masterclass in shape control as well, whether it's the approaches to smoke and steam within the film and how the shapes, which are maybe sometimes based in ones, how these are influenced by how they are shaped and what that tells us about the destructive power of some of these weapons. And that kind of all feeds into the discourse of power and what power and authority really means. It's also amazingly balanced as well as a piece. We often do talk about Akira's action animation, but it's also an amazing piece for understanding character acting alongside stuff like destruction as well. So explosions, I said before, smoke, steam, things collapsing as well. Akira's great at debris animation and all those things, as well as just the action and racing. I say quote unquote racing, I just mean driving. But overall, it's just a massive package to explore. It's a gift. It's a gift from Otomo and the team behind it. But by fixating on this one idea of smoothness, I think it weighs down a lot of the casual discourse on Akira as a visual piece. It's held down by a very misguided, or rather misguided and narrow idea for such an amazing piece of work. One of the most interesting pieces of work I've ever watched from a visual point of view. It's ironic that it's basically just tied down to one thing, and yet it teaches us so many more things about animation, and if I dare say, another thing I'd say is slightly empty visual storytelling. It teaches us how those things really can come together. I might even go as far as saying that it even undermines Ultimo's narrative and the production as a whole despite some of these insanely good animators and staff like the unfortunately late Makiko Futaki. You might know from a lot of the Ghibli works. A really famous scene from her would be in Ponyo when Ponyo is chasing down the car. One of my favorite scenes from her. Also other very popular animators like Toshiyuki Inoue, and even one of my favorite creatives in the industry at the moment, Koji Morimoto. All of these stuff have come together to make such a great work by using all these different techniques and ideas which make their animation so exciting to watch, honestly. And I feel like that's all squashed down by one idea that Akira is so smooth, it's animated in ones. So what I'm trying to say is that smoothness to describe something isn't particularly bad. I think it is bad as a value judgment, because as a value judgment, it assumes that it is good that it is smooth, and I think within the realm of subjectivity, if I can call it that, it doesn't mean it's good or bad, it's whether it meets what one wanted to do and whether the audience perceives that as a positive thing for the narrative. And yes, this does get a bit nihilistic, because then we can say, what descriptor really is good? What can we say that doesn't have an empty meaning? But I think all meaning is simply relative to the piece of work which we're describing. And by holding animation, or at least Japanese animation, to this idea of smoothness and smoothness only, we miss out on what else animation can be. And that's what I'm going to dive into in this next part of the episode. There are three pretty big ideas that I want to kind of tackle. I'm going to tackle one in detail, but I'm going to present to you these three ideas when it comes to animation and how much more nuanced it is beyond the notion of smoothness and smoothness alone. Animation to me is about how every single frame is utilized to achieve a certain goal. It kind of leads back into this idea of relativity, which I just about discussed. How every frame is used in one film is very different to how another film uses every single frame. Even if they're in the same genre or so, even done by the same person, they can hold completely opposite meanings because it's relative to the very narrative and detail which is being brought to us. And so it can't really be said that it's based on one thing, and we can't hold smoothness as a standard, because smoothness will vary in how appropriate it is depending on the work of which it's on. This then goes into my second idea, which is smoothness is not the golden standard of animation or even a requirement of it. Animation does not need to be smooth. It's more of when it's described as the reverse, like, oh yeah, it looked kind of choppy, it doesn't really flow together, but I think a lot of the discussion needs to be oriented around why is it not flowing as quote-unquote smoothly as you want it to. It just does feel like it is, again, going back to what is at the top of the pyramid being smooth, but I think we need to collapse the pyramid, and that there really shouldn't be this apex of smoothness which needs to be achieved. And then the final idea, which is the one which I want to discuss really, and it's that the worship, and I say in quotation marks, of smoothness obscures everything else animation can do and what it can focus on. There's much more to animation beyond how quote-unquote smoothly it moves and what timing it's on, but there are so many other aspects to every single drawing beyond just how it flows into the next image. I do think that there could be a lot more emphasis on ideas like form and shape, and even the potential lack of fluidity and stuff like spacing and how these connect together, as opposed to is it smooth or is it not. I think that is very reductive. It waters down the discussion because we don't consider the why, but we assume that it should be something already and the other is simply suboptimal. But I don't think there is a suboptimal idea, because that, my way of thinking anyway, doesn't really consider smoothness as the apex of animation or what it should be. Some of my personal favorite animators like Shinya Ohira or Hironori Tanaka or Shinji Hashimoto and many others, that some of these animators have a lot more to offer than simply whether their animations are smooth or not. And even many of the animators within Akira as well have a lot more to offer than this simple and rather reductive idea. Many times I would say that smoothness isn't really something that fits these animators because they have different things to offer besides the flow of things and the flow of images in this, what you consider optimal fashion. Sometimes they manage to disrupt this pattern or even just focus on other things which make their animation of equal merit because that is what manages to achieve what needs to be achieved within said narrative or within the piece. Hironori Tanaka, for example, an animator which is actually quite popular right now or is in discourse at the moment because of their episode direction and storyboarding in episode 13, I believe it was, in Jujutsu Kaisen. But what they focus on is manipulating anatomy primarily, and usually it's that of hair and sometimes and recently hands. The hair basically talks to us. It manages to divide itself into several individual strands, whether it's to portray speed or shock or anger or angst or anything, really. And what makes Tanaka's work so gripping to me isn't really the timings of the hair and how it's animated like that, but it's really where it moves and the shapes which they take, which influence our understanding. In the case of Black Rock Shooter, it's used in one of their fight scenes to portray nervousness and even slight shock in a sense when we see these strands just pop out at us at a random, not random, but at a very brief glance in what seems like a close-up of one of the main characters, for example. In Bakemonogatari, Hironori Tanaka uses hair as a means of showing furiosity and almost a sense of being feral, if I can say that. I won't go too deep into that one. But holding animation hostage to this idea of smoothness as the quote-unquote peak or a thing that it must be, we forget what animation is, essentially. Animation is so multifaceted, and when we just summarize what good animation is as clean or smooth, we make animation this very rigid mold, and we don't really explore much else. We simply can't put everything under an umbrella idea and expect it to work magically. And because it's simply not an inclusive term, and no, there will never be a single term that defines everything, but my critique really is that smoothness doesn't really say much at all about the state of Japanese animation, which is so varied and so diverse as a meta in animation. If you've ever watched an anthology, you will see the amount of variation between every short piece within that, let alone the entire meta alone. And when we squash animation, and if we are specific in relation to this podcast, Japanese animation, we really lose a lot, or we filter out almost all of the works because they barely fit the mold. Animation is form, animation is shape, animation is size, animation is disorganization, animation is organization, animation is all of this. And when we put it into a shoebox as to what it is, the beauty of the works which we love are obstructed, and I don't think we can really unlock the potential of them by relying on a single term or a very narrow amount of terms. With that being said, that is the analysis for this week. I do want to keep this episode short, and the fireworks are about to come out right now. I did say Happy New Year, but it's not New Year here yet, and so I'm rushing to finish this one before I simply just can't record anymore. And so I haven't really prepared segments for this week. I should have that running by hopefully next week or the week afterwards. We do have some exciting stuff coming up, so that should be good. But this week, I'm just going to keep it simple and go to closing thoughts, because I think that this is hopefully an episode that can be referenced later on and people can potentially learn from my argument. It isn't a correct one, and I'm never really trying to impose a correct one per se. I don't think there is one in this case, and it would be ironic as we are talking about subjectivity quite a lot here. But I want to at least have this one in the archives, so if anyone is confused about the idea of smoothness and where it fits into animation, I do want to say that I don't think it has the biggest place within it anyway. But with that being said, let's go to closing thoughts, and I'll briefly wrap up the main points from this podcast. I think this is a fundamental problem with the animation discourse generally, or at least discourse surrounding animation. It's not really connecting how animation can portray emotion, and for that we need to challenge what animation is and what it can do and how it's varied. Japanese animation doesn't simply come in, oh, it's smooth and smooth communicates. I don't know, in the case of, say, fighting animation, a confident character, yes, it can do that, but let's use an example like something animated in fives. How does something in fives communicate something else? And that connection is simply one which isn't made enough, in my opinion. I think we need to move to a place where we're going beyond just calling something smooth and ending the conversation, because smooth is not the peak of animation. There isn't really a peak per se as to what it should be, and this goes beyond animation really. This is a general thing with literature or art, questioning why beyond what it is, because we found our assumption on what something should be, but we need to eliminate the what it should be to begin with. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. That has been episode 76. I hope you did enjoy this one, and I hope I didn't come off as rude. That is the last thing I wanted to do. I did get a bit passionate, maybe borderline salty, but I just wanted to make a statement, and hopefully that is one which is understood. Obviously, it's not the right answer, but it's simply my answer. If you do enjoy the podcast, as always, it would be great if you could, if you're on YouTube, to subscribe, like. The views have been going up a lot, and I'm very happy, so thank you for viewing. It really does mean a lot, especially if you are on audio, and then you also go into the YouTube one, and you like and subscribe, whatever. That is so appreciated. I can't thank you enough. Even if you're only on audio and you decided to go to YouTube, that is a really big thing, and I can only thank you for that. I don't think I said, but leave a review as well on Apple Podcasts if you can. That really would help the show. And I do want to get more reviews as well, because I do want the show to grow this year. So hopefully we can move our way up on the anime podcasting ladder, both on YouTube and on audio. That is it. I'm not going to prolong this for any longer. I will see you on the next episode, episode 77. We're on the double numbers. I have been your host, Jamar, today, and this has been Get in the Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows: 8-bit title screen by Joth, Mandatory Overtime by Joth, and Difference by Chasers Gaming.